Hello and welcome to part 2 of the 4.4 IB Biology Notes. So last time in part 1 we talked about the greenhouse effect and how different gases are able to absorb long-wave radiation that is re-emitted from the Earth and reflect it back to the surface. The radiation that comes from the sun is shortwave, and so it passes through the greenhouse gas layer, but the energy that is re-emitted by the Earth gets reflected off in long-wave radiation, and those long waves are unable to pass through the greenhouse layer. So that is the basis of the greenhouse effect, and we said that in a normal circumstance that is beneficial to us because it helps keep the Earth's temperature relatively warm. Planets with very little to no atmosphere tend to be quite frigid and would not support life, so it is beneficial to us. But in this graph, we can start to see how humans are impacting that. So we've got a little bit of a complicated graph here. We're looking at a correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and average global temperatures. So that blue jagged line is the average global temperature per month since 1880 up until about 2000. And the scale for that is on the right. And the reddish orange line there is CO2 data from ice cores. So what was the atmospheric concentration of CO2? And we can get that data from ice cores. So we dig into the ice, we take a long core, and the ice has air bubbles that were trapped when the ice froze, and we can actually measure what the air was like at the time that ice froze. So that's how we get that data. And then the yellow line is actual direct readings from a weather station stationed in Hawaii. So those are direct readings. So you can see that the overall CO2 levels pretty closely correlate to the global temperature changes. They look essentially like a trend line of the global temperature changes. So we can see over here, global temperatures show large variations, of course. It's not a smooth line. There's a lot of up and down. Some places they're well below the CO2 level. Some places they're well above the CO2 level. And it's not perfectly smooth. They do show variation. However, within this variation, we can see that there is very strong support for a correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and global temperatures. We can see that as carbon dioxide levels are increasing, global temperatures are increasing as well. So both of those are increasing. So this is our evidence for a correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and average global temperatures. And some of you are going to say, well, we know that's a correlation, but we also know that correlation does not necessarily equal causation, so these two things could be unrelated. And that is a perfectly valid statement from this graph, but we have some more evidence to talk about. So first, let's talk about how some of that data was obtained. So earlier, I talked about ice cores. So basically what happens is you can see these people are holding these long cylinders of ice. So they take a coring device, which is it pulls out these long cylinders. It drills down into the ice layer and pulls out these long cylinders. And essentially what you're looking at is the closer to the surface the ice is, the newer it is. The deeper the ice is, the older it is. And so you can kind of see in this picture that there are these distinct layers, and those show years, essentially. So each year a new layer of ice is deposited, and when it is deposited you can see in there all these little specks, these little speckles. Those are air bubbles. And you can simply directly test those air bubbles. So you take a sample of the air and you can test the concentration of different gases within that air. So you can get information about the concentration of carbon dioxide, the air temperature. You can get all sorts of information from the time when the ice was formed, and we use that to estimate data for before a time when we had direct measurements. It's quite accurate, but it is not a direct measurement. So, if we look at the past 400,000 years, which is what is shown here, so this is the past 400,000 years data from those ice cores. And as I said, we can get information on CO2 concentration, which is this top graph, and we can get information on temperature, which is this bottom graph. So you can see that the correlation is that carbon dioxide and that carbon dioxide is correlated to average global temperatures is supported by this graph. So they both tend to fall at similar times. They tend to spike at similar times. It's not perfect, and temperature does show greater variation than CO2, but we don't necessarily need a perfect one-to-one correlation. Most of the rises and falls in CO2 have correlated with temperature rises and falls. And this is not only from this ice core. This same trend has been found in other ice cores. We see this pattern of CO2 falling, temperature falling, CO2 rising, temperature rising. And we get that throughout all of our data. So there is very strong evidence that atmospheric carbon dioxide is quite closely related to average global temperature. Again, correlation does not necessarily prove causation, but when we combine that with what we talked about last time, which was greenhouse gases, and the fact that carbon dioxide in and of itself is a greenhouse gas, that tells us that this is most likely a causal relationship. So because greenhouse gases are gases that absorb heat and reflect it back in the earth and essentially increase the temperature of the earth, and because we know that carbon dioxide is a very prevalent greenhouse gas, because it is both present, so abundance was one of the factors for greenhouse gases, and also because it absorbs heat very well, because we know it has those characteristics, and because we see this data here, that all together can be taken as a causation. So it can be determined, it can be deduced, to use the IB terminology, that CO2 concentration is causing these temperature changes. And so again, as we said, they're not necessarily direct one-to-one relationships every single time, but we can see that in general, when we have increased carbon dioxide levels, we correspondingly have increased temperature. So we take all that data all together and we look at it, and we know from what we know about carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, from what we know about greenhouse gases, and from what we see in this data, we can deduce that the increases in carbon dioxide are causing the increases in temperature. And so how does that apply to us now in the current global warming, climate change situation we find ourselves in? So if we look at this graph, we have a bunch of different things, right? So down here on the x-axis, we have our years from 1850 to 2000. It's a pretty broad scale. And then on the graph itself, we have a couple of different data measures. So the solid line is the total anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So what that means is the total amount of CO2 emissions from humans. Anthropogenic just means human caused. So the total amount of CO2 that humans have emitted. This dashed line is 46% of total emissions, so it's just a 46% of this line. The solid lines that we get over here in this region, those are CO2 levels from direct measurements, and the dashed lines that we see over here are CO2 levels from ice cores. And you can see the ice core data is a little bit more general. Whereas the direct measurements, of course, if we're directly measuring, we can measure it every single day, and so you're going to get a little bit of a spikier line. And so because we know that there is a strong correlation between human emissions and atmospheric levels of CO2, and we can see here that as atmospheric CO2 levels have increased, the amount of CO2 absorbed by carbon sinks has also increased. So what does that mean? When humans are burning fossil fuels, that means it's a combustion reaction. combustion reactions release carbon dioxide. And so that carbon dioxide is going to go into the atmosphere. We can see that here. Some of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, though, because of what we know about the carbon cycle, it's not all going to stay in the atmosphere. Some of it is going to get absorbed into plants, but also a pretty large portion of it is going to get absorbed into other sinks, such as the oceans. So the oceans are going to also have increased CO2 levels. So we can see here only about 40% of emissions have remained in the atmosphere. That means 60% of those other emissions are absorbed by other sinks. So things like the ocean absorbing CO2 levels. So it doesn't just increase the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, it increases the level of carbon across all of the carbon sinks that we have seen in the carbon cycle. So, global average temperatures. That's the big concern right now, is global average temperatures. It's not your day-to-day weather, because global average temperature increases are going to cause all sorts of factors. However, we also know that global average temperature increases are not directly proportional to greenhouse gas concentrations. So we saw that in the previous slides, where it wasn't necessarily a one-to-one correlation. There are other factors that impact global average temperatures. So things like sunspot activity, so the amount of energy coming in from the sun, things like volcanic activity, all of these things can impact average temperatures. But because we know carbon dioxide's role as a greenhouse gas, and because we know that greenhouse gas emissions cause increased temperatures, we can infer then that in general, the big thing that is changing over time is not sunspots. Those are relatively regular. It's not necessarily volcanic activity either. The big thing that has changed over time, specifically since the 1850s or so, is carbon dioxide emissions. And so we can infer that that is probably what's causing those changes. And increases in greenhouse gases are not just going to cause changes in global average temperatures. They are going to cause more frequent and intense heat waves. They are going to cause some areas to become more prone to droughts. They cause all sorts of effects, and some of them are opposites to each other. So while some areas are becoming more prone to droughts, other areas are going to get more intense rainfall and flooding, and tropical storms are going to become more frequent and powerful. And we have seen some of that. There's been an uptick in the number of strong hurricanes over the past 10, 20 years or so. There's also going to be changes to ocean currents, and this is going to cause actually colder temperatures in northwest Europe. So that's one of the reasons that scientists kind of have moved away from the term global warming and have adopted the term climate change, because it's not just about the warming, it's about overall climate changing. Some areas will get cooler, some areas will get drier, some areas will get wetter, but everywhere on Earth will be impacted. There are also some other impacts, such as possibly an uptick in pathogens and diseases, and that is something that we are definitely seeing right now as well. So I said earlier that all of that carbon dioxide does not just stay in the atmosphere. Some of it gets absorbed, and specifically it gets absorbed into the oceans. And the big problem with this is when I add carbon dioxide to water, that causes a drop in pH levels. Okay, it causes acidification. So we get ocean acidification as a result. And research is indicating that we are losing coral reefs because of this. Because when the acidity increases, so that's a pH decrease, coral reefs are primarily made of calcium carbonate, which is something that we also looked at in the carbon cycle, same thing that limestone is made of, and that dissolves in lower pHs. So as the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide, it is going to cause acidification, which is going to impact anything made of calcium carbonate. Specifically, we are interested in coral reefs because they serve as an ecosystem to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species. And so there's estimates that 1 million species depend on coral reef habitat. So loss of this one animal, which is coral, could compromise the viability of all of those different species. So it could have very widespread effects on, on the oceans as an ecosystem. So the ocean absorbs about 25% of the CO2 emitted, and so therefore we can see up here this purple line is atmospheric CO2 increasing, and as that atmospheric CO2 increases, we see seawater CO2 having a corresponding increase, and as that seawater CO2, as the amount of carbon dioxide in the seawater increases, we get a corresponding decrease in the pH of the seawater. So as atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, so do the levels in the ocean. And since 1800, the pH of seawater has fallen by 0.1 pH units. Now that doesn't sound like a lot. However, it must be remembered that pH scale is logarithmic, so that means a drop of 1 full pH unit is a 10 times change. So a fall of 0.1 pH units is a 30% increase in acidity. That is huge to these very sensitive ecosystems that are being affected by this. So that's a big change in a relatively, on a geological scale, a relatively short amount of time. It's going to have massive impacts on those species. And estimates of further future CO2 levels indicate that seawater could become nearly 150% more acidic. So a further decrease of half a pH unit, which is a level that has not been seen in more than 20 million years. So it took us 20 million years to get to the current pH level, and in just 300 or so years, we're going to go backwards. So that's a very short amount of time. It does not allow species much time to adapt to the new changes. And that is going to cause massive losses in biodiversity, specifically in coral reefs, which are one of the main sources of oceanic biodiversity. And so basically the chemistry involved here, I touched on earlier. When CO2 dissolves in water, it forms a variety of molecules. The primary one here, though, is carbonic acid. So we have carbon dioxide dissolving in water, and carbonate ions, which are just dissolved in the water already. And so those are going to form bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a buffer, essentially. So when those are formed, these kind of help to buffer the pH level to prevent it from changing too much. However, there's not a whole lot of carbonate ions. So once the carbonate is no longer present, then we're going to start to form the carbonic acid, and that's already the stage that we're in now. So carbon dioxide, instead of forming bicarbonate, is just going to go straight to forming the carbonic acid, and so that is going to cause all these decreases. And basically, what's at risk here? Anything that has calcium carbonate shells. So that includes coral, as I said, but also includes mollusks. Anything really with a shell is going to be affected by this. They need those carbonate ions to make the calcium carbonate in their skeleton. So if those carbonate ions are instead being taken up by carbon dioxide, they're not going to be as available, and their shells are not going to be as strong. So they are going to have much more limited survivability. So there are, of course, claims that human activities are not causing the climate change. Essentially, not all of these do not tend to be empirically sound arguments. Okay, so some people will say that the climate has changed before. Well, sure, but the climate reacts to whatever forces it to change at the time, and right now, that is humans. Some people will say, well, it's the sun. They'll look at what we said earlier about sunspots. Well, in the last 35 years, the sun has actually been getting less active, and the climate has been growing warmer. So those are very contradictory. Some people say it's not bad. Well, I think we can spend all day highlighting negative impacts on global warming for not just other species, but for ourselves as well, because it's going to impact agriculture, which is how we get our food. Some people say, well, there's no consensus. Scientists are still arguing it. That's not true. 97% of climate experts agree that humans are causing global warming. That's about as close to 100% of people agreeing on a single thing as you're going to get. Some people say it's actually cooling. Well, the last decade was the hottest on record. We consistently set record high months. These arguments, in general, are just not sound. They are usually looking for excuses, and if you look into the records of people arguing for that, they tend to have some sort of monetary interest in it. So it's important to know the motivation of people publishing claims. So anytime you see somebody making a claim, it's really important to look into what they have at stake for it. Okay, so if they are being paid by oil companies, they are going to be much more likely to come up with oil company favoring conclusions. So I'm not saying that those people are bad, but it is really important to understand what is the motivation of somebody who is publishing their claims. And that concludes topic 4.4. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.